TLDR for the Disco Dancers. They're below average for the vast majority of partners, quite good for a few. I don't think they're ever really amazing, but they'll also never be horrible. So they're sort of a safe second pick in a snake draft if you see something useful that you can pair them with in the partner faction. Or if everything else left besides them is garbage tier, they'll always be better than garbage tier. In this video, I'm going to talk about 4 specific partner factions that I recommend the Disco Dancers to. Most of the other options, they'll probably be around the ratings I have listed. First, what do the Disco Dancers do when they don't have a particularly good partner faction? Well, their main game is using Diva and Dancing King to make a standard action that is an action not played on a base or on a minion affect an extra target. And they have a few decent candidates for this in their own faction just in case their partner doesn't bring anything. Get Down Tonight is just a +2 power boost. Unfortunately, it's a one of. I'm So Excited is a movement that they can duplicate. And Turn the Beat Around is a special that they can duplicate. Choose a minion to gain +1 power until the end of the turn. The Divas and Dancing Kings can copy this. For each minion affected by this, you can give another minion -1. So you essentially steal 1 power for every time Turn the Beat Around happens. This is enough to get something accomplished. And then they have the best looking card, at least, of their actions is Last Dance. Each player may destroy a minion they control. For each minion actually destroyed, its controller gains 1 VP. Now, I looked at this, and my first thought is, well, in 1v1, if these guys get out ahead, they can use Disco Lou to put it back on top of their deck. They can, repeatedly play this with Diva to get 2 victory points to their opponent's 1, put it back on top of their deck with Disco Lou, and take a game-winning VP lead with direct VP from Last Dance. That doesn't really work. It's a little bit too slow, and their opponent can usually go ahead and win the game while they're trying to do it. It also would entirely not work at all with 3 or more players in the game. However, what you can do with Last Dance is use it as endgame insurance. If you're sitting at 13 or 14 victory points and you're at least tied for the lead, a Last Dance of appropriate size, either a 1-0 gain over your opponents or a 2-1 gain by using 1 Diva or Dancing King, can get you to 15 points first and end the game with no muss or fuss. And usually there's a certain amount of risk inherent in these end games. Just because you're up 14-13 doesn't necessarily follow that you'll be up 16-15 at the end of the game. It could be that your opponent wins a base with a 2 victory point difference, and then you've just lost. You might notice that I haven't mentioned this card, We Are Family, and it basically converts a minion that wasn't already a diva into a diva of appropriate size. The problem with this is you have to spend an action to play it, you have to already have a minion in play to play it, and most of the time, you're not going to have so many actions that you want to duplicate that We Are Family becomes a very good card. Most of the time it's just a little bit too slow, but sometimes it can be relevant. So that's what you'll always be able to get out of the Disco Dancers. You'll get a faction with a little bit of its own shtick that it can do, moving or boosting multiple minions. Their roller is probably about a 2.5 if they have an irrelevant partner, and it's just straight up a 3 if you've got a partner that's always going to want to do something to it. And this is enough to make sure that they'll never be garbage tier. But of course, if their partner faction brings something useful to the table, they can get a lot better than this below average tier. Most partner factions aren't going to have any cards that interact very well with Diva. They need to be standard actions, and they also need to be something positive that you would want to do to the minion, because while Dancing King can duplicate an action onto an opponent's minion, and We Are Family could also be played on an opponent's minion, Diva can only copy actions onto itself, and that means that, say, destroy a minion of power 3 or less is not going to have a heck of a lot of synergy with the Disco Dancers. Unless, of course, you have a base where destroying minions grants VP. This is the most obvious card that you would want to pair the Disco Dancers with, and as a matter of fact, they're a pretty good Dinosaurs partner. The only problem I have with this pairing is neither Disco Dancers or Dinosaurs are a terribly good first pick in a draft, so you'd need a fairly bad draft pool to actually want to play this deck. Nevertheless, if you happen to have these two factions available, when you're taking the last pick of the first round and the first pick of the second round, you might be able to get a good Dino Divas deck out of it that's good enough to be better than your opponent's decks. Another similar faction. Oh, and I showed you augmentation. Howl, I don't think Howl targets, so Howl probably doesn't work. But even if Howl works with Diva, an extra +1 power is not a huge deal anyway. So it's really augmentation and not Howl you're looking at. Now we also have the Astronauts. Use the 4s is an augmentation. You have 2 block the paths, which is a +2 that can be played as a special. And you have a Yield the Rage, Yield to Rage, which is +2 power. All of these can be copied by Diva, and all of these are enough to make Diva consistently a 5 power minion when she needs to be one. So the Astronauts are your second good disco partner. Now the third partner I'm going to recommend, I'm mostly recommending for multiplayer, Giant Ants. Giant Ants, I talked about them in the video. They're pretty awful in 1v1. I hope they get a Titan, but their main problem is the fact that they take a little too long to set up. In Smash Up, I think you usually can afford to spend about 1 full turn on setup before you need to do something. I'm mostly basing this on my experiences so far with the Fairies Titan and a little bit of common sense and experience with the game. Giant Ants usually require 1.5 to 2 turns to set up, which tends to be too slow. In a 2-player game, your opponent will often discard your setup by breaking a base. In a multiplayer game, while you're setting up somewhere, your opponent's broke another base on the other side of the board, and you're now too many victory points behind, and you're likely competing for second place. But Diva and Dancing King can meaningfully accelerate the Giant Ant's development. The trick here with Ant Divas is Gimme the Prize gives you a +1 counter on up to 3 of your minions. Roller will gain an extra +1 counter from this if it started out without any counters. Diva will be able to duplicate it. Diva should be able to duplicate it even if Diva is also a target. Dancing King will be able to duplicate it. And that's enough that you should be able to play a Gimme the Prize on 2 minions at one base, hopefully one of which is doubling it, and 1 minion at a second base, with the idea that you get to the kind of power total, the kind of number of power of counters at one base that a lot of Ants decks would have reached anyway, but you're also accelerating yourself at a second base. And if you do this a couple times, you can get to a point where even if you suffered through the usual Ant deck woes at a couple bases, you are now ahead of the curve enough that you can catch back up and get to the point where eventually We Will Rock You becomes a good card. That was one of the other things I talked about in the Ants video, is that you can play to make your opponent's We Will Rock You a bad card. Simple fact is, if your opponent doesn't have enough power counters in play before they use their action, We Will Rock You doesn't do much. Anything that accelerates your gain of power counters makes it that much harder for your opponent to restrict your We Will Rock You to being too small to be a big deal. And so this kind of Ant Diva buildup can get you to a position where maybe eventually Factory drops and you're able to play a huge We Will Rock You there and just win the game because you've been able to get a little bit ahead at each base. Maybe if even you were just collecting second places in a 3-player game. Headlong is another way of getting yourself ahead long. And it's going to get you 2 extra power counters rather than just 1 if you duplicate it on the Diva. You're only going to be duplicating one part of the action, so in general you're going to want to duplicate the power counters because Ants are effectively a setup faction. So that's Diva Ants, which I also think is worth trying. And the last faction I'm talking about is the Mad Scientists. The Mad Scientists are usually better in a 2-player game than a multiplayer game, despite that they have no cards which target their opponent's cards. And I'm well aware they have one card which can target their opponent's cards, but it shouldn't. That specific card should be placed on the bottom of your deck with Angry Mob, because it's more effective that way. I'm honestly not sure if Jolt targets, but like Howl, it's only a +1 difference if it does. It's Alive, however, I'm pretty sure It's Alive does target the extra minion plate, and so Diva will get you an extra +1 counter with It's Alive. But there's two real winners for the Mad Scientists. If you've played the Mad Scientists a while, you know what two cards, I mean, obviously the monster is good, but you know what two cards finish your opponents off. Angry Mob and Body Shop. Body Shop destroys one of your minions, preferably an indestructible one, so it fails, and places +1 counters equal to that minion's power, split any way you choose on your minions. With Diva, you stick, you kill a 4-power indestructible minion, you're putting 4 counters on one minion at Diva's base, and then 4 more counters on Diva. That's a lot of extra power, and that's enough of a burst to be pretty indefensible. Angry Mob doesn't even require an indestructible minion or a minion placed at the wrong base to be useful. You just stick a bunch of cards from your hand on the bottom of your deck. There's always going to be at least one card in your hand that you want to put on the bottom of your deck by late game because you've probably drawn Blitzed. And you get to put 1 +1 power counter on the minion for every card you put on the bottom of your deck. It does have to be your deck, as I understand it. Treasures will not help. Diva is fantastic with this because Angry Mob is often 8 extra counters or something insane like that when you play it. And so with Diva, it's 16. That's a lot of power. So those 4 partner factions, I would really recommend the Divas to them as your second pick. If you have most anything else, I would take an average faction over the Disco Dancers, unless possibly you think your deck also already outclasses your opponents by a little bit, because Last Stance does give you that endgame insurance, which I think means in the long run, the Disco Dancers are going to win more of the games they should win than most other factions do, and lose more of the games they should lose than other factions do. So that's the Disco Dancers. Of course, I go in the shower and promptly think of a 5th good synergistic partner, and that is Vampires with their Titan. The new factions with their Titans tend to prefer partners that don't have a Titan themselves, and Ancient Lord requires you to place 2 power counters in the same turn to bring him out. The Vampires can do this fairly consistently, but they still appreciate some help, because without help from either Roller or Diva duplicating a power counter drop, they often have to rely on finding a target to kill with Night Stalker, which requires something of 2 power or less, or being at least 3 power behind on a base somewhere so that they can play a Fledgling and put a counter on her. And that slightly restricts the plays they can make if they want to bring their Ancient Lord out. Diva and Roller give them probably about twice as many different possible plays that can bring an Ancient Lord out, and that improves their flexibility as well as just speeding them up a little bit. So that's good partner faction number 5. And I think 5 is a decent amount of selections, although you might notice that most of them are not great factions, which is why it's kind of hard to play the Disco Dancers well in a draft, but they're still factions that appreciate having a good partner.